Chapter 32, Mr. 7 o'clock News. Don't worry, Auntie, we'll be all right. Sade tried to sound confident. Femi trickled his fingers down the misty glass of the cramped call box. The concern in Aunt Gracie's voice sparkled through the telephone wires. It was going to be a freezing night. They could get lost. London was dangerous. Their father would be terribly worried if he knew. Why did they have to go on their own? Uncle could take them. He would come for them if they would just say where they were now and where they wanted to go. 3 pips called urgently for more coins. Please, Auntie, we'll come. The line went dead. Sade's hand trembled as she replaced the receiver. How could she explain that this was something she and Femi had to do by themselves? So many dreadful, frightening things happened to people that were never reported, like to Mariam's family, or to those people at the screening unit, like the mother with the face of sunken dunes. With so many stories, why should Papa's tale matter enough to become news? But if Mr. 7 o'clock saw 2 children on their own, he might just stop to listen. It was up to her and Femi to show that it mattered. They jumped on the first bus with Waterloo Bridge on its list of destinations. It was one of the names Sade had written onto her own map. She would have liked to ask the driver where the bus would go after that, but he was a scowling man who shoved their change so roughly that she kept quiet. The bus downstairs was full of passengers. Femi clumped up the stairs and Sade followed him without protest. It would also be easier to see from on top. We have to look out for the river, she told Femi, without adding that it was her only sure landmark. The bus carried them over the Thames on either side, along the riverbank. Great buildings towered like castles with thousands of lights sparkling between the violet sky and the mud-coloured water. The river looked nothing like the fat blue snake on the library map crossed by a zigzag of yellow stripes. It seemed even more remote from the squiggle of lines on the map in her hand. On the library map, she had counted 5 big yellow streets that they would have to cross before the long road where they would find the television studio. But there had been lots of little streets between the yellow ones, and Sade was soon confused. Every street outside the bus appeared large enough to be coloured yellow. She had to do something quickly before the bus moved too far from the river, and she lost her bearings altogether. Excuse me, can you tell us where we are on this map, please? We want to go here, please. Swallowing her shyness, Sade propelled her sketch towards a young man sitting alongside them. He blinked in surprise, then brought the paper so close to his face that it almost touched his nose. The longer he spent examining it, the faster Sade felt her heart pumping. Her map was much too rough. She should have copied it out more clearly. By the time the man could make sense of it, they would have gone too far. They should at least get off the bus. She was poising herself to speak when the young man handed the map back. They were in luck. The bus would actually go along the end of the road they were looking for, he said. He would point it out to them. Once off the bus, the children steered their way through figures wrapped securely in coats and scarves. Shops and offices were closing and people were going home. A plump Father Christmas and an airy snowman twinkled down at them above the streetlights. Giant stars and Christmas trees flickered above the traffic. However, around the corner, the road was not so lit so brightly. Cars and taxis still roared past, but there were less shops and people, more shadows. Listen, child, London streets are full of strangers, and some are very sick, you know. Your daddy is trusting me and Uncle Roy to take good care of you. Aunt Gracie's words echoed in Sade's head. She remembered Darth Vader of the alley lunging out at them on their first night in the city. How far is it? Femi mewed. Sade was peering through the gloom at each new entrance, searching for signs and brass number plates. She had no idea what kind of building they were looking for. It can't be far. You lie. How do you know? You haven't been here before. It was the whine that always got on her nerves. Then why ask me such a stupid question? Sade bit her lip. The moment the words were out, she knew that they were a mistake. Femi stamped to a halt. If I'm so stupid, why do you need me? I'm going home. Give me my bus money. Don't be so... Sade swung around. Femi's jaw jutted out fiercely. He was serious. He might even try to walk all the way if she refused to give him his bus fare. Her whole plan was going to be ruined. Oh, don't let's argue, Sade pleaded. I'm sorry. It's me that's stupid. We won't help Papa if we fight. Slowly, Femi's jaw and shoulders relaxed, like a bristling cat letting down its hair. They set off again in silence. Ahead of them, most of the buildings were shrouded in darkness. Was this really the right street? Sade would have liked to check her map under one of the pools of light, but she dare not let Femi see any doubt. Her face prickled with the cold and her fingers stiffened despite her gloves. A glow of light and 2 taxis pulling up alongside a row of great white pillars were the first signs. When they drew nearer, they could see the building was quite different from the rest. Behind the pillars, the pavement sloped up towards 2 large revolving glass doors. The entire wall was made of glass. Inside a brilliantly lit hall, glossy green trees grew in huge tubs and televisions hung from the walls like decorations. For a while, they stared without speaking at this world inside a world. They could see everything but hear nothing. People walked briskly from the revolving doors to a man behind a desk. The buttons on his uniform glinted as he nodded and pointed. "Will that man let us in?" Femi asked. Sade had only imagined being with Mr. 7 o'clock himself. She hadn't thought about getting past any guards. And if she had to ask for him, what would she say? Suddenly, she couldn't even remember his real name. Whatever would she call him? Hardly Mr. 7 o'clock news. "We'll have to wait outside. No one can chase us away from here." Sade tried to keep her voice low and calm. Mr. 7 o'clock was probably inside the studio already. At Papa's office, the journalists worked for hours before the paper was published each day. She and Femi might have to wait until the programme was over. She raised her watch towards the light inside the glass wall. Just past 5:30. The news finished at 8. She hadn't thought about the waiting time. "You're mad, it's freezing." Femi dug his hands deeper into his pockets. "When he sees it that we waited in the cold, he'll listen to us," insisted Sade. "We might be dead." "Be serious, Femi. You know what I mean." I am serious. You are the one with the crazy ideas." Femi's voice rose indignantly. He blew out a mouthful of air and a thin mist of steam rose under the lamplight. "Like Papa," he added under his breath. Sade was not sure she had heard correctly. She did not want another argument, certainly not one about Papa, nor outside the television studio. It was unlikely that Mr. 7 o'clock would appear before 8. Femi was probably right. They would freeze just standing there. "Okay, we'll come back later. I've got money. We'll get fish and chips. I know you like them." Before he could push her away, Sade put her arm around Femi and steered him once again into the shadows. As soon as she had said fish and chips, Sade wished she hadn't. They had not passed any fish and chip shops along the way. They would have to walk further on up the road, which seemed even darker than the direction from which they had come. "We can go there," Femi pointed to a restaurant on the other side of the road. For a brief moment, it seemed ideal. If they sat near the front window, they could keep an eye on the entrance to the television studio. But even before they had stepped onto the pavement, Sade knew it was not possible. Silver cutlery glinted off linen tablecloths. A waiter was folding napkins and placing them upright like fox ears. Another was beginning to light candles. "We don't have enough money for this place, Femi." "Let me see," he said boldly. There was a menu by the door. "What does this mean, Sade?" Suddenly there was an edge of caution in his voice. Some words were in French, but before Sade could reply, Femi whistled. £14? Femi pointed to an item about a fish baked in wine with ingredients Sade had never heard of. She pulled at Femi's arm. This time he did not resist. They walked further from the television studio, the more murky and desolate the street became. There was something menacing and grim about the buildings, as if phantoms might be lurking behind the doors. She tried not to let Femi feel her fear. However, when 3 figures emerged into the dimness ahead and came reeling towards them, she clutched her brother's arm. He, in turn, snatched her away towards the road. They hovered on the edge of the gutter for a moment, trapped between the staggering bodies and the headlights of a vehicle. Then a strong stench of alcohol hit them and a sound like a bull in pain. As the car's rear lights receded like discs of fire, they dashed across the road. Sade was about to urge that they should turn back when Femi pointed to a light shining from a doorway in the next block. They would go as far as that. It was a tiny shop, and the shopkeeper was bringing out a grill to close for the night. The children slipped inside behind him. The man's cap and tunic reminded Sade of Mariam's uncle, although Dord's store was twice the size. But here too, newspapers, magazines, sweets, biscuits, drinks, and all sorts were crammed onto narrow shelves. Certainly no fish and chips. Sade grabbed a packet of chocolate biscuits, and Femi yanked open the cabinet with canned drinks. The man studied them with a weary patience as Sade handed him her coins. Femi did not argue as they set off back towards the television studio, nor did he mention fish and chips again. Ahead of them, the great white pillars now stood out like distant beacons. Once again, the revolving doors and the lights both beckoned them and held them at bay. Sade was painfully aware of the time. 2 more hours outside in the cold. The only place that seemed to offer any shelter was a small recess next to the restaurant with the silver cutlery and candles. It was actually a doorway set back from the road, and at first Sade expected someone to come out at any minute. If they were asked what they were doing, she would say that they were waiting for their father and then move away. Where to, she did not know. Femi tore open the packet of chocolate biscuits. 2 biscuits were enough for Sade, but Femi continued munching until only a couple were left. Sade decided not to drink her Coke. It would make her even colder, but Femi ignored her advice and gulped the contents of his can. After he had finished, he stood with his teeth chattering. Sade suggested they play word games to pass the time, but Femi was not interested. For a while, she tried running on the spot to keep warm, but her legs became so heavy with the cold that it was too much effort to move. Femi was now frozen into silence and did not resist when Sade pressed close to him, twinning her arm through his. At least they could share whatever little body heat they had together. All the while, Sade kept her eyes trained on the other side of the road. The revolving doors were never still for long. It was like watching a strange dance inside and outside the glass. Some people stepped away purposely, but very often a figure strode onto the pavement with an arm held aloft as if raising a flag. A black taxi would roll up, absorb the figure and whisk it away. Sometimes the arm had to swoop up and down a number of times before a vehicle came. Only occasionally did someone cross the street as if coming towards them, but no one appeared to notice the children. It was difficult to see her watch in their dark corner. Sade made herself wait a little longer each time before trying to check it, as if that might hurry the minutes along. Instead, the long needle seemed to become slower and stiffer. When at last it was 10 minutes to 8, she and Femi had just become as stiff as themselves. They hobbled across the road together and placed themselves alongside the glass wall a little way aside from the revolving doors. It was still better not to attract the attention of Mr. Buttons behind the desk. 8 o'clock, 5 past. Where was Mr. 7 o'clock? 15 past. Was it possible to become paralysed through cold? 20 past. A tall, thin man with silver grey hair, who had his back turned to them, was walking away with one arm raised. Surely that was him. How had they missed him coming through the door? He was calling a taxi. He would be gone before he had seen them. Sade wrenched Femi from the glass wall and tried to run. Her bones felt brittle enough to snap. Please, wait, please. Her words fluttered out jerkily. Mr. 7 o'clock turned as Femi slipped and slid and tumbled towards his feet. Swinging an arm forward, Mr. 7 o'clock grasped him just before he hit the ground. A black taxi purred to a halt next to them. Please, please. Sade's words were as cracked as her lips. We need to see you, please. Mr. 7 o'clock's eyes were larger than she had imagined. His forehead furrowed as he helped Femi up. Then glancing across at the taxi driver, he shook his head. Sade's heart leapt. He was going to listen after all. Guided through the glass doors, past the desk, and Mr. Buttons into the lift and through corridors, Sade ignored the curious eyes, aware of only the tall man behind them. He was like a great sail, pushing them forward, protecting them. Outside, Sade had tried to rehearse where to begin. From the shot that killed Mama, or before that with Papa's articles, or later with Papa and the false passport. There were so many possible starting points. In the end, she did not need to worry. Mr. 7 o'clock waited patiently as he sat opposite the 2 children. With a sense of touch beginning to flow back into her fingers around the mug of hot chocolate on the table in front of her, Sade found the thread she needed. She began with Papa locked up in Heathlands Detention Centre. Papa, who believed so strongly in telling the truth that his articles made the Brass Buttons generals in their home country very angry. So angry that gunmen had tried to kill him and killed Mama instead. Slowly she unravelled the tale. Mr. 7 o'clock's nods encouraged her. Finally, she explained that the immigration people were thinking about sending Papa back into the arms of those who wanted to do away with Papa. They did not seem to understand. That was why she and Femi had come here. Mr. 7 o'clock leaned forward. And what about you two? You haven't said much about yourselves. Where do you go to school? He probed gently. Despite the soft tread of his words, they disturbed something deep inside Sade, like a buried mine erupting. The wall behind Mr. 7 o'clock faded, and she saw him as he had been in her dream, with his keen blue eyes straining against the sun and the dust-filled wind. She couldn't take them looking into her anymore. They would surely see what kind of a person she had become. Tears swamped her. Embarrassed, she tried to wipe them away. She had not prepared herself to talk about themselves. I'm sorry, I didn't mean... Mr. 7 o'clock delved into his coat pocket and pulled out a neatly pressed handkerchief to Sade. We were smuggled. Femi arched his eyebrows. He had been stubbornly silent until now, not saying a word. Sade even had to give his name to Mr. 7 o'clock. But now, just when she suddenly felt herself falling apart, Femi was stepping in to rescue her. It was horrible, he announced. He spoke bluntly about how Mrs. Bankole, how she had taken Uncle Tunde's money to pretend that they were her children, then deserted them as soon as they arrived in England. How they had been left all alone because they could not find their Uncle Deli. How a man in the dark alley robbed them, and how a man in a video shop had accused them of being thieves. And Femi told Mr. 7 o'clock how they had themselves been fingerprinted into the asylum screening unit, just as if they were thieves. More words flowed from Femi than he had uttered in weeks. His outspoken words made him sound almost like Papa. Then, as suddenly as he had begun, he stopped. He seemed to have exhausted himself. Mr. 7 o'clock's face was grave. Who was taking care of them now, he asked, and where were they living? He would arrange a taxi to take them back. He thanked them for coming and telling them his story. Certainly, he would look into Papa's case further. However, he could not promise it would be made into a news item. Shepherded once again through the corridors, past doors behind which journalists prepared the news, Sade felt her heart quietly throb.